Okay, it says we are live now. So this is Don't Let It Go. My name is Amy Peikoff, and I have the pleasure and great honor, as always, of speaking today with John Allison, who is the former chairman and CEO of BB&T. That is probably the way that he is best known to our audience, but he is also right now executive in residence at Wake Forest. Is that correct? At the business school? Yes. And then you are also on the board of many organizations, including, I believe, Cato and the Ayn Rand Institute. Is that right?
That's correct. Absolutely.
As well? Okay. Well, I thank you so much, John, for giving me some time of yours
Sure.
today. I know we've spoken in the past about your book, but when we started talking seriously about reopening America in this coronavirus era, and I was starting to think about who would be the person best equipped to discuss how business might do this in the most sensible way possible, I thought of you immediately. You are the person to talk to. And in addition, I have always found your rational optimism so comforting. And so, I kind of go up and down, and maybe all of us do, and you can tell me how you feel. But I've felt at times in the past week, gosh, I'm really glad I have John Allison coming on, because I can use some of that as well. I just, everybody's got their challenges in life anyway. And then if you put this layer of coronavirus on top, it's some stuff. So I wanted to ask first, how are you? How are you? How's your family?
I'm doing very well personally, as is my family.
Okay,
Everybody's doing well.
So you guys are working from home, basically?
Yes, and including my son, who's getting a PhD at Michigan State. He's home at close the university. My daughter and my son-in-law and my son's wife are all working from home. In every case, they've, quote, been sent home.
Okay, and so everybody's got their different workspaces. And then, have you ever done the Zoom meetup where you all meet up on Zoom just for fun? You haven't done?
No, my wife does that, but my children are at our house in the mountain. We have a house in the mountains in North Carolina.
Oh, okay. Okay, so on separate campuses, so to speak.
Yeah.
Right now. Okay.
Good for them, good for us.
And are you teaching any classes right now through Wake Forest?
No.
Okay, so you were lucky that way not to be.
Very lucky.
Okay. Yeah. So in general, I mean, we haven't really even compared notes on this, and there has been some division among, I think, all intellectual groups, but among objectivists and sympathizers, there has been a lot of fervent debate about it. So what do you make of the entire thing? Do you think it's nothing more than a flu and lockdowns were never justified at all, or it is something serious that we should worry about? It is in fact maybe an emergency or not? Lockdowns in general, specifically, what's your view on all this?
Well, Amy, when this started, we didn't have good information because of the lack of information from China. That is very, very unfortunate. But what we know now is that we're very unlikely to reduce the number of people that get this virus by having a lockdown. The virus is not going away. It may be deferred to the fall, but it's not going away. The second thing we know is that for people under 60 in particular, this is not a very bad virus. In fact, for people under 20, it's not as bad as those flus are. If you look at deaths from this virus, 85% of the people that die from the virus are over 65. Mm-hmm. And the vast majority of them already have some health problem. Right. And of the people under 65, almost 100%, something like 99% have some kind of health problem. So the truth is, this is not a particularly bad virus. It's not a good virus, and what we should have done from day one was focus on older people and people that have health problems and let the rest of our society to continue to operate based on what we know now. You can argue.
Yeah, that's based on what we know now, right? Exactly.
But we could have reacted a lot sooner because we had a lot more information sooner than we did. And we really overreacted, I believe, early on.
Okay.
We knew that the lockdowns were only going to defer the virus when we started because viruses don't go away that way. And we knew it would probably take a year to get some kind of successful vaccine. Maybe we'll get it in less time than that. So we've incurred an enormous amount of economic costs and a lot of it unnecessary. And yes, we should have protected old people, people with health issues, but you know, it's sad because it's going to be hard to get our economy going again. And unfortunately, a lot of people are still spooked, you know, because the media has played this up so dramatically. Even when the statistics, you know, they started out predicting 2 million deaths, and then they got down to 1 million in the US, and then they got down to 100,000. It's a long way. And that, you know, we had 80,000 deaths from the flu 2 years ago, and nobody knew it.
Right.
So,
yeah. And now what you're hearing are weird anecdotal sorts of things about, well, maybe even though people aren't dying from it, there's some long-term condition that it's setting off in their bodies. And I'm reading things, you know, it's going to reduce your lifespan by 13 years, even if you survive, and et cetera. And I feel both that some people don't take it seriously enough, but at the same time, I do feel that the media and even some in our government have been stoking fear in all of us for their different reasons that they have for doing so.
Yeah, that issue on reducing life expectancy, there's actually no evidence. I mean, that's just conjecture. And, you know, getting the flu may reduce your life expectancy.
Sure.
And what we do know is that the number of deaths in the United States since this started is actually less than usual. Now, partly that's because people aren't driving their cars and they aren't doing the things that they would ordinarily do. But it suggests that the virus has not significantly increased the number of deaths that would have occurred anyway in a normal flu season.
Right. So could you say that, given we didn't know all of this in the beginning, suppose our leaders had said, we're going to have a 2-week lockdown only because we don't know what we're dealing with, and we're going to ramp up both of our information and testing capability. And part of this is necessary because our healthcare system has been atrophied by decades of government intervention. And we're sorry about that. We're going to fix that. We've seen the error of our ways, but sorry, everybody's got to hang home for a couple weeks and that's it. Could you have seen a role for something like that back then when we didn't know all this?
I think there would be a much better argument for that than what we
But now it's time to get going.
Now it's absolutely time to get going because the economic damage is going to be very severe.
Okay. So we'll talk more about sort of the government policies and the damage that they've done as we get into this. But first, I want to talk about the reopening. But I want to ask one thing before we get into the issue of reopening, and that is China. What has happened to your perspective on China due to this?
Well, my perspective has been negative for a long time. That doesn't mean that I thought we shouldn't trade with them. That's a different.
Okay.
I think.
And you can elaborate on how you kind of.
I'm an advocate of relatively free trade. I think trade benefits people and they don't trade unless they're going to get better off. At least it perceives they're going to get better off. I have long thought the Chinese were dishonest. If you've ever dealt with them, it's kind of a cultural thing. It's not just the top. It's the whole culture is not fully honest. It's very evasive for lack of anything else. I think this has emphasized that. I do think this has raised some issues about certain kinds of dependencies. For example, what percentage of your medications ought to go from China? You know, that's a huge issue. So I think that this has raised some legitimate issues that don't necessarily directly relate to free trade, but they do relate to free trade with a society that's not very honest and semi-totalitarian, at least in many aspects. So I'm still for relatively free trade, and I think we ought to look at things like drugs and essential things, and just say, well, those can't be made in China.
Yeah, things on which you wouldn't want to be dependent on them.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that makes sense. So, again, I told you last week, I think when I asked you, I was really interested in your perspective on reopening. If you were still a CEO today, what would your thoughts be about the best way to go about this sort of thing safely? What's your advice for anybody who's out there contemplating doing this?
I think the biggest challenge for reopening is the potential liability. I mean, in our country, you can be liable for things that you shouldn't be liable for. There has been some discussion in Congress about putting some caps on the liability, and I think
Mm-hmm.
that's critical. Still, you got to go back to business, so you can't really totally avoid the liability risk without changing the law. I would open up. I would open up systematically. I would only ask people to come to work if they wanted to come to work. I wouldn't make anybody come to work. I would use as much social distancing as you can, encourage wearing masks. I don't know how meaningful these things are, but I think they're things that we ought to try to do.
Right.
I would certainly, if we had it, I'd certainly want to test people, but we don't have enough tests to do that. But I would certainly say that anybody that's not healthy, don't come to work. If you think you've got even a cold, don't come to work. And also I would strongly encourage people over 65 not to come to work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Maybe even over 60.
Right.
But I think the risk is very much concentrated on older people. And I would encourage anybody that has any kind of health issue not to come. And I wouldn't let them come if I knew that, if they had disclosed that somewhere.
Diabetes and such, they're saying, could be a
Some
comorbidity, right?
But I would go ahead and open up, and I would do it in an organized fashion. I think you'd find a lot of people want to go back to work. It gets pretty old, kind of being locked in your house. And a lot of people need the money. I mean, it's these small businesses in particular have to open back up.
Right.
We've created a huge injustice. Walmart's open. Walmart sells everything. At least in North Carolina, they're open. They sell everything.
Yes.
They're taking sales from small businesses that small businesses will never get them back. And there's a chance they won't get the customers back because customers change their buying habits.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
And it's really tremendous amount of injustice involved in this process, a tremendous amount. But I think it's time to go back to work. And based on what I know, I would systematically encourage my employees to do that using basic health safety measures.
Right, right. Now, they have proposed, for instance, Governor Abbott in Texas has proposed opening, they're starting this Friday. And for example, for a restaurant or a movie theater, there's going to be 25% capacity to start. And some people have pointed out the idea that with the 25% capacity, it's not even worthwhile for the business to open. Now, maybe you could say if it's that plus takeout or something for a restaurant, together you could put that. Some people have opened, I think, in some places, and then people are just walking by. They don't even dare do it yet. What about those types of businesses? What would you propose?
Well, I think that we're going to face a period where people won't go in restaurants, or some people won't go in restaurants. On the other hand, I think young people are going to go in restaurants. I think there can be a capacity limit on restaurants, but I mean, you have 300 people in Walmart. It's kind of like how much difference does it make? A small restaurant that maybe has room for 30 people. Maybe they should have 20 or something, 25. But I think I think you've got to assume that people have a mind, and no customer has to go in, right? People make their own judgments of whether they're going in. And in a free society, you get to do things that you're willing to take risks to do.
It seems like a rational judge should not hold a restaurant liable when everybody is well aware that they're choosing to go do this and that there is still a risk of catching the virus, and that so long as any business is doing what any reasonable restaurateur would do, given the circumstances, that these suits should be dismissed. But I think you're right that our legal system is broken, not just our medical care system.
Yeah, and I think for any business, that's the biggest issue. But unless that issue gets resolved by Congress, you can't ever get open because you'll certainly be broke before you have a chance to get open again.
Do you see that getting resolved by Congress? What's your sense?
Yeah, I think they're unfortunately probably tied into another incentive bill. But I think one of the things they'll stick in the next incentive bill is some kind of liability protection, as long as you're using some kind of basic safety measures. I hope to see that. I don't want to see another incentive bill. In fact, I think the incentive bills have been very, very destructive in terms of long-term economics. But,
yeah, I definitely want to go into that in a
sure.
minute, and the evaluation of Trump in general and how he's handled it. But what about North Carolina? How has it been there? What have you thought of the handling there? I remember that there was in national news very vocal and active protests against lockdowns in North Carolina. So how is it there?
I think the lockdowns have been very excessive for this state. Now, you can make some arguments that they should have focused on places like Charlotte and Raleigh, where you have large populations that are concentrating together. But there was no justification for locking down the whole state. You know, we have a little farm in Ashe and Allegheny counties, which are in where North Carolina, Virginia, and Tennessee go together. They've had one case in each one of those counties, one case, and nobody's died. And yet the restaurants are closed, and it's dominated by small businesses, and many of them will never open, and Walmart and Home Depot are open. So it really is sad. And a lot of small business owners they don't get unemployment. They just lose their livelihood.
Yeah, and try to apply for the PPP when you're really tiny and you don't have a relationship with an established bank and all of those things, right?
Yeah. And I'll be honest, I'm worried about the PPP. My experience with the government, you can't trust them. You know, during the last financial crisis, a lot of banks had made loans based on government guarantees and insurance, and the government said, "Oh, we didn't mean to guarantee these loans," or there's something wrong with that. You got 200-page application. This paragraph 87B's got one word wrong in it. I mean, and I don't trust them.
Right.
I don't trust them. So maybe out of desperation, I'd take a PPP loan, but it would have to be absolute desperation.
And you're saying that from the perspective of a bank who is going to grant the PPP loan, or you're saying from the perspective of a small business?
A small business, because I think they'll get lots of rules and regulations that could come out of that, depending on who's the next president, who's the next Congress. So people that got this quote welfare might have to have a minimum wage at $20 an hour. So
okay. You're talking about the strings attached to it.
There will be strings attached to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the banks may also get screwed.
Right.
I'd actually predict the banks will get screwed. I don't think there's anything they can do but do it now, because they got too many customers in trouble and there's too much political pressure to do it. But I'd be surprised if the banks don't get taken advantage of. And I'll be surprised if small businesses don't get stuck with bad legislation in the future, like minimum wages increase and things like that.
Right. So in this kind of next tranche of money is going to be, I believe, infrastructure. And one of the things I've been concerned with from a privacy perspective is that they keep throwing around broadband as one of the infrastructure pieces that they want to finance with this bill. And the strings that they want to have attached to anything having to do with the internet infrastructure, big tech or whatever, they all scream anti-privacy. They scream, that they're going to probably get rid of end-to-end encryption. Nothing that's encrypted would be allowed to flow over the broadband subsidized by the government or something like this, right? So there, of course, I've been thinking along the strings attached, but I hadn't thought about strings being attached to the PPP, both to the business owners, and then of course, yes, banks could be left in the lurch. So that's a terrible thing.
And I don't see what infrastructure has to do with the pandemic. It's nonsensical. And
do you watch the briefings? Do you watch the briefings mentioned up there?
I can't. I've watched some early on, but I quit.
Okay. Because I saw the one where he was describing this infrastructure bill, and the argument for it was, in effect, that because Trump had been talking about infrastructure since his campaign, therefore that's a good thing to do now.
Well, except we just spent $2 trillion.
Right.
I mean, it's kind of different. I'm not sure how we pay all this money back. I know a lot of people just aren't worried about the debt level. I happen to be.
Yeah. So where does this come from, and what about the debt level, and what's your warning about this?
The implication is higher taxes for the long term. It's highly unlikely we won't see some significant increases in taxes.
So it's going to mean higher taxes, and those taxes won't be to pay this off necessarily. It's just going to be to service this debt, right?
And operate the government in its current operations, not pay the debt back.
Right. Right. And actually, the other thing that we've been seeing is that they say that they're going to borrow this at 0% interest rate. What does that mean?
Well, I mean, the rates are so low, they can borrow at a low interest rate, but you still got to pay the principal back. And it also really get a 0% depends on how long they finance it for. They've had a tendency in recent years to do very short-term financing and roll the debt over. And if rates rise, that's going to put a huge strain on the U.S. Budget, huge strain.
And you see the rates rising at a certain point.
Well, if we continue to accumulate the debt, I think they will rise. I don't predict it in the short term because we're a long way from getting our economy back to going at full speed again.
And you predict that even if we get going today, there's going to be a big financial shortfall we're looking at. I mean, we've seen some numbers today, 4.8% in the first quarter, I guess, reduction in.
And we really didn't have much impact in the first quarter. Most of the impact, of course, was the second quarter. And there was a lot of momentum. If we hadn't had this announcement, I would say the first quarter probably would have been up more like 5 or 6%. We had great momentum. So you got from what was possible to where we were. And I think the second quarter, particularly if we don't get going soon, I think it's going to be, you can't always put Pandora back in the box. There's a lot of things that are integrated together, and what's essential and not essential is a very interesting question. It's not government bureaucrats are answering that question. They're answering it different, by the way.
Mm-hmm. No, I've heard some very capricious essential versus non-essential designations depending on what state you're in. And
terrible examples,
Have you had any there in North Carolina that have impacted you personally?
No, I haven't had anything, but I mean, except I'm locked in my house. I mean, I'm not really.
Well, I mean, you're allowed to go out to parks and such like that there.
Sure.
And you're doing it, I trust. Get outside. You're getting outside.
Oh yeah. And of course we have a farm, so I have an excuse that I need to go. Well, ours is a farm that raises apple trees, and my wife has bees, so I've got an excuse.
So you're making regular trips there.
Yeah, agriculture is an essential business. But I do know a lot of people that have been impacted. Now, one of the things that I thought was the worst, they closed down the Outer Banks to people that didn't live there, even though you own property on the Outer Banks.
Oh.
And that was decided by a local city, or I guess county commissioners. Where in the world county commissioners get that kind of power? And there have been so many violations of individual rights. And you keep saying, where does the government get the right to close every business down in the state? Where does the government get the right to force everybody to stay in their house or try to force them? Yeah, where do these powers come from? They're certainly not in the U.S. Constitution. What about, I'm not a religious purpose, but what about saying you can't go to church?
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't go, but maybe churches would have voluntarily closed down. But where does that come from? Doesn't the First Amendment protect people's right to go to church and take that risk if they want to?
Well, and then, of course, if the government does ban, and it does so for indefinite periods of time in an unreasonable way, what they're courting then is irrational disobedience, not any kind of civil or rational disobedience, but the irrational. I mean, if you were right now operating in North Carolina as a business owner, would you be tempted to do what I've actually heard? There's a business here in the United States, and I plan to interview them, in California. I plan to interview them on Friday. They have announced that notwithstanding Newsom's plan to keep California completely shut down, they are opening for business on Monday. And they've just advised local government, everybody, we're going to do it according to, social distancing guidelines. And they have a business model that allows them to do that. But I mean, is this the sort of thing that you would consider doing if you were a business owner in North Carolina?
It would obviously depend on the kind of business. I was a banker. If you have a highly regulated business, they close you down in a minute. So you don't have any choice on that. If you have an industry that's not very regulated, yes, I would certainly consider. If I ever had a small business, it'd be open. I had an experience, I guess it was the day before yesterday. My wife asked me to run an errand. And while I was running the errand, I stopped by a local sporting goods store. It's a small store. I didn't really think they were open because they're supposed to be closed. We kayak, and I wanted to get some stuff from my kayak. And I walked up to the door, and they opened the door, and they had other customers in there. They were open.
Wow.
And then I went over to a local kitchen place that sells kitchen supplies. And I had told my wife that, well, they can't be open. But she said, oh, well, you ought to go see. So I went, and they were open. They let me in.
Okay.
So you are already seeing civil disobedience. I don't think that's necessarily good, though, because I think not in an individual way it's good, but in terms of the ultimate rule of law, when people don't think what the government's doing is legitimate, and I think that's what that means, that's not healthy for society long term. It's maybe necessary in this case, but it's not healthy.
Would you see a difference if it was done surreptitiously, which I assume the two examples that you gave were, versus what my interviewees on Friday are planning, which is, again, they did a very open, they said, we're doing this on Monday, and here's why. And they explained, and they realized it was an act of civil disobedience and that they're doing it anyway, and they have good reasons for it. I don't know that the principle of rule of law goes astray in that circumstance, where basically you're saying we will challenge through the system.
No, I agree with you. That's because what they're doing is actually challenging the law and saying you didn't have the right to do this in the first place, which I happen to agree with.
Right.
Because I don't think the government had the right to do a lot of stuff they did. They closed down the state parks in North Carolina. Why? There's no evidence that people get the virus in state parks, none. And they just closed them. They closed down children's playgrounds. Children under 10, the death rate's 0.
Yes.
Unless they've got some other really serious disease, but
right.
I mean, they just don't die from this. And they closed the playgrounds.
Yes.
Also, the sun kills the virus anyway.
Exactly. We learned that as well. So, yeah. Which brings me to our president, because of course the whole thing about the sun kills the virus ended up being part of a presentation did you watch the relevant clips of that briefing where he then went on to talk about potentially we could inject these agents into bodies and stuff like that? No, you didn't even watch those, but you heard about it.
I've heard about it.
Okay.
That was bizarre is the only word I would have.
So what do you make? I mean, obviously you're not in favor of the various spending bills that Trump has put through, and that's, you could talk more about that if there's more things that you need to know. Some people have been asking what in the world should they do with their money during this time, given that that's happened. But then feel free to comment on Trump in general if it's changed your view of him in any way.
I think the spending bills are really mixed bag in this sense. I think that a huge percentage of it has nothing to do with the virus. Increasing the debt at that level is terrible. On the other hand, and this is where I think you get into an ethical dilemma to some degree, the government shut these businesses down.
Yes.
Put these people out of work. I mean, it wasn't the normal economic process. It wasn't that they did anything wrong. The government closed the businesses.
Right.
So I think there's an argument for some special unemployment insurance and disposition for businesses that were severely damaged through no fault of their own and not even economic factors, just what in retrospect looks like arbitrary and incorrect government decisions. Mm-hmm. So in terms of Trump, I'm not a big Trump fan. I think that he's handled this very poorly. I think he's had no strategy from day one. I think he's a terrible spokesman because he's all over the place from one day to the other. And he's proposed a lot of preposterous things, which is unhealthy. Now, I'm not saying he's not better than Joe Biden. That's one of the dilemmas we face.
Right,
From a political perspective. Biden seems to have not to know what the heck he's doing, so it's very discouraging. I think we had very poor leadership. If I had been in charge, I wouldn't close the country down. I would have been very aggressive about communicating the risk of this, the people that are at risk based on what we have, the steps that people can take to protect themselves, but I wouldn't close the country down. Because I don't think he really had the right to do that. This is not an act of war. I mean, they say this is war power. We're not at war. This is not a war. And I think that expansion of government authorities is really dangerous in the long term.
And so given that he has gone this route, actually, let me back up one question. Do you think the reason that he ended up doing this was as like an overcorrection, given that he had minimized it at the beginning? And do you think he was minimizing that at the beginning because he was still concerned to have good trade relations with China?
I don't know why he minimized at the beginning, but I think he actually was pretty realistic in the beginning in retrospect. Now, people say, but actually he was probably pretty realistic in retrospect. Mm-hmm. I think it was political pressure, which I think is a shame. I think once you get to be president, even if it means you're not going to get reelected on something as significant as this, that's impacted basically the lives of every person in America, you can't do it for political reasons. And I think he was reacting to political pressure.
Okay, so you think that his error was not so much in his evaluation at the beginning, but his being able to be swayed by maybe his experts combined with political pressure.
Yeah, and the experts were making predictions when they really didn't have any information to make those kind of. In fact, the information they had coming out of China, which I agree was misleading, was this thing wasn't that bad. Because they weren't having that many deaths in China, theoretically. Actually had a lot more deaths. Right. But the information that we actually had really said it was foolish to close down. But when Europe started closing down, I think Trump felt political pressure to do it. And individual states acted, and to the degree the governors actually have that authority, then let those states act. But don't put pressure on everybody to act.
Right.
I would say off in his defense, he didn't actually do as many negative things as the governors have done.
Sure. But I mean, you could argue that in our federal system, it's the states that have always been thought of as the ones who, if anybody has the power to do this sort of thing to protect the general welfare, it would be more the states. Right?
I totally agree with that. I'm just saying that you can't blame Trump for what the states did. And the states were the ones that really had the authority to the degree there is anybody's authority to do this. So it's a little bit unfair to blame him either way, although his personality and his style and his lack of leadership is very, very negative.
If you were to give him advice today about how to correct course as best as possible, like you were saying, there's Pandora's box and maybe there's some damage already. No, probably there is damage already that can't be undone. What would you advise now?
I would encourage him to encourage the states systematically to open back up, and particularly the states that don't have big problems, and which is a lot of states. On one of the commissions I'm on, we're working on a map that looks at where you can argue they ought to stay closed, which, you do have in, certain kinds of epidemics that close cities, and we've had that over history.
Sure.
But if you look at the map, there are only really a relative handful of places that ought to be closed by any logical argument. New York City, Chicago, Detroit, New Orleans, most everywhere else by any kind of logic based on past history ought to be opened up. And I think if I were him, I'd get that map out and I'd point, this is, these places you can't make the governor do it. It's not his, he doesn't have that authority, and he should say that. These are local decisions. But if I were in charge, if I could make these decisions, this is where I'd open it up, and this is where I'd be concerned. And I actually think we would reduce deaths by doing that, because obviously one thing you learn in business is focus where it makes a difference. And that's older people in certain localities.
Yes.
But even in New York, it's still older people. It's not.
No, and part of that apparently is because of Cuomo ordering nursing homes, which is one of the most horrible places to be if you're concerned about contagion of anything infectious. He's ordering he had been at least ordering the COVID patients to be accepted back in after supposedly they're recovered, but probably aren't. Right.
Yeah, I mean, that to me was crazy.
Yeah. And to me, it speaks that they're not actually concerned about what they say they're concerned about, because they're not acting as if they really were motivated by the, the things that they say are motivating them.
I think they're motivated. I don't think they want to kill people. I don't feel that, but they do like power, and power corrupts. And I think that's dangerous. And going back to Trump, I think he ought to say a lot less and have it focused.
Yes. Yeah, he's gotten in trouble. Now, I heard that he's been pulling back in the last days. I know he just got roasted on Saturday Night Live last weekend by Brad Pitt, of all people.
Really?
It was beautiful. I'm going to have to send you the clip if you haven't seen it. Because I'm hoping that you've had some comic and other sorts of relief during this time. So you're working actively on a commission in order to put together recommendations for someone on this. Is that right?
Yes, this is actually a presidential, I don't know how much role Trump played in this presidential commission. And our role is to, how do we open the economy? What are the steps?
Okay. So you're getting to inject your voice of reason into this, which I love to hear.
When you have, I think there are 12 people on the commission, maybe 13, and you try to influence the 13, but you don't get to do exactly what you would like to do. And there's lots of things we'd like to do we can't do, like testing. We can only do it in a limited way. It ought to be focused on where it makes the biggest difference. And you obviously ought to keep investing like crazy in vaccines.
Yes.
There's a ton of regulations. We're going to go the wrong way. There's a ton of regulations that ought to be eliminated. One of the big culprits in this, in my opinion, is the FDA.
I was going to ask you about that. Yes.
Oh, they are a huge culprit. First, not having a test, which they could have developed if it didn't cost billions of dollars and takes 10 years to develop some kind of vaccine. You'd already have vaccines on the shelf. Maybe not one exactly for this, but one that could be easily converted to this. But people can't spend billions of dollars in 10 years when they don't know whether they'll ever get to use a vaccine. It's the whole FDA process is crazy. Plus restricting people from developing, making it hard to get masks. Ventilators, they used to be cheap, and they passed a whole bunch of rules so you have good ventilators, except if you don't have one, it doesn't matter.
Well, and now apparently ventilators aren't the treatment of choice anyway, and he's got so many excess. To me, I don't know if you haven't seen the briefings, but in each briefing, people will ask him about testing, and he'll deflect by talking about how great he's done with ventilators. And he's got all these ventilators, and he's exporting ventilators and ventilators. And as I understand it, that's not even the treatment of choice anymore. It just shows the inefficiency of central planning.
Well, by the time you get to a ventilator, your survival rate's not great.
Yeah. So
it's really very, it's good we have thousands of extra ventilators. And we had thousands of extra ventilators. But we wouldn't be talking about ventilators if the FDA hadn't imposed all these rules that made ventilators so expensive.
Well, and that's what they do. It's like government can't seem to get its hand out of the jar in any way, right? So it goes from preventing things from being produced, manufactured, offered to people. And then if they say, oh, you mean we have to allow people to do it? Well, let's make sure that we are also involved in the doing of it as well. And so he's out there, telling these big manufacturing firms that they have to retool their whole facility to start making ventilators. And then he goes bragging about it. It's like, just leave the entrepreneurs free to do it. I'm going to beg you about something right now. Insofar as you have any voice of reason into a commission like this, have you talked about the tracing technologies at all?
Yes, but I don't really remember exactly what the conclusion was.
So as I understand, there are two different options. One is that the government stay involved in it, and they are in charge of, and they produce and they manage the tracing technology, the technology aspect of it. And then on the other hand, we have Apple and Google. Apparently they have an app that is up and running already in Australia. It is ingeniously designed because it works off of Bluetooth. The information is stored only in the device. So from my perspective, where I talk about this third-party doctrine, you might not even be sharing the information with a third party. It might be stored on your encrypted, locked device. The data is deleted after it's 21 days old to correspond with the incubation period of the virus. It is genius as far as I can understand. And I can imagine from past experience that it would be way more efficient than any government solution as well.
I would think that would be true. Of course, our general thing is to say, let the market work, let entrepreneurs work. And if Google or whoever, Apple wants to offer that product, then people can buy it. We don't think they should be forced to buy products.
No.
But what will happen, of course, if it works, it'll sell very, very quickly. So yes, we support innovation free from a whole bunch of government rules and regulations and government involvement. We think every time the government involves in it, slows things down and makes them much, much more expensive.
Yes. And so if you could have any voice towards that, because apparently some states are already starting to develop their own apps and things like this. And I can only expect that that's going to be clunky. It's not going to work. And that, these politicians, they get so invested in it that they want to demand a monopoly over this. And they're going to try to prevent an Apple or Google from giving us a very practical and I think privacy respecting solution. I'm concerned about a tool like that in the hands of government as well. You could imagine.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we talked about that a little bit, but in general, we say that businesses should be able to develop products and offer them, and consumers make their own judgments. And the government shouldn't be involved in stuff it has no skill set for. It's going to make a mess, including state governments. We don't think that we hadn't taken, we probably would never go to court because it's not the nature of the commission. But we don't think states have the right to do that.
Right.
Where did that come from?
No, exactly. And maybe it's not your commission's place to take them to court, but some business who's willing to level a challenge, maybe Apple or Google, it'd be great if they would challenge this, because it could benefit all of us if we're allowed to have access to the app. They're doing it in Australia now. I mean, I'm kind of horrified that we have been caught so flat-footed compared to South Korea, Germany, maybe now in Australia with the tracing. Testing, we were very behind in our country. And yes, testing is an inherently limited thing, right? No matter what great test there is, there's always some limit on it. And we can turbocharge all the information, the results that we get from that by doing effective tracing. And this is, I think, a huge part of that. So
sounds like an excellent idea to me.
Yeah, it would
know
be
enough about the technology
It sounds genius. So it's Bluetooth. And so if you and I were in roughly the same location, close enough to have a Bluetooth connection for, I believe, 15 minutes is the length, then it would record like our, the identity of our devices at least, or something, right? And so I would have it stored in my phone and you'd have it stored in your phone. And then if either of us later got tested for coronavirus and got positive, and we put in our thing, because we're going to be good people, as good citizens, we don't want to infect our fellow human beings, or if we learn that we did so accidentally, inadvertently, we want to inform everybody, go get tested like David Latt did, right? So I put in my device, I've tested positive, and then it's going to notify you to go get tested.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea.
No, it's a beautiful thing. So I hope that. Okay, now I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit of YouTube chat. I want to go into, if we could, some questions that have come up from supporters, if we haven't already covered the material. I have just a few, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Okay. First one is from Nancy. She says, I've always wanted to ask Mr. Allison if he was aware of business process insights developed by Dr. Goldratt. Goldratt, Goldratt, most famous for The Goal.
I am not.
Okay.
I don't know about it.
Nope.
Sorry.
She thinks that this Dr. Goldratt was a genius, and maybe his insights would be useful to you. I don't know. There's a book called The Goal. So if you have downtime during your, it sounds like you don't have much downtime, that your life is fairly similar in work to it was before, right?
Well, I'm just not traveling, and it's kind of weird, but I'm staying as busy.
Yes. Yeah, that's what I figure. Okay, here's from Jose. He says, despite the massive loss to individuals and businesses from this situation and the shutdown, what might be some new opportunities growing out of this era?
Well, I think it's interesting to reflect on this. Will we have learned how to do work better, more productively using technology instead of going into offices? I don't know the answer to that. I personally miss the human contact, but I also see an enormous savings in time, and I think we probably see less travel, like business travel. I don't think it'll go to zero. I think that if we get some deregulation around this and it works, somebody comes up with a vaccine or some other ways to treat this, and it's because the FDA wasn't in the way, people are going to have to start asking the question, do we really need the FDA, or do we certainly don't need them the way we had them? So I think you could have some good results. And actually, I'm optimistic in that sense, that I think crises, they cause negatives, but they also create opportunities for innovation. And I'm hoping there'll be some lessons learned. Now, I'm very concerned the government will have expanded its role. Privacy rights will not be as protected as they were. And we almost never roll those things back. Every time we have a crisis, we get more government, more destructive going. I don't know what the Federal Reserve will have learned by printing money willy-nilly and making loans to people they don't know how to make loans to. Be interesting to see what they learned, if anything, out of that, and whether they've made a big mess. But I do think there'll be some innovation, and I hope there'll be some deregulation that relates particularly to the medical industry, which is so grossly overregulated.
Yeah, it would be nice to think that we could avoid the massive expansion in government that followed 9/11. Unfortunately, new agencies, the Patriot Act that has hung on all this time, and everything else. But I guess you're right that, I mean, we should be realistic about what government always tries to do. And then at the same time, be optimistic about what private individuals might do in the face of this and innovation, right?
Yeah, I think the private market can still outrun the government, but the government's going to continue to be a drag, and probably a little bit bigger drag. It's just its basic nature.
At the very least, a financial drag through the higher taxes that you mentioned. Yeah. I think you probably have already answered this, but this is from James. He says, I'd like to hear what he thinks the consequences will be of government creating trillions of dollars from nothing and injecting it into the economy. He says, so we sort of talked about that. He says, a follow-up could be, what would you recommend people do with their money to best shield themselves in that event? And he says, personally, he's more worried about being in the high-risk group economically, which actually we all are.
Yeah, I don't have I can tell you, I have a diversified set of assets. I'm a farmland buyer, and I'm real estate, but I still have a big chunk of the stock market. I have some low risk bonds, and I think that's all you can do, because it's impossible to guess where this is going. I do think this is a wake up call in terms that there's more risk than a lot of people think. The stock market's fallen, depends on how when you look at it, it's fallen 20-25%. So it's important for people to wake up and be sure they are diversified, and that they think about the risks they're taking. I think you might, I'm optimistic in this regard. I think you might see some movement towards currencies that are not government fiat currencies. I'm not sure which ones will be the winners.
Are you a Bitcoin fan, by the way? I don't think you are you?
I'm not a Bitcoin fan because it's really not a currency. It's really a speculating tool. But I am a fan of the idea. I think that, having a currency that's controlled by kind of computer systems and limited is in the end going to put a dent in fiat currencies.
And apparently transparent too, from the people who have been telling me about it, that the transactions, even though I think that's kind of anonymized in the register or whatever it's called, it's transparent in terms of where it's going.
But you do have a relatively small number of players that have a huge share of the market, which is kind of dangerous, and are able to move the market around for their benefits, up or down to some degree. But I think with the Fed printing money like this and other central banks printing money the way they are, the fiat currencies are at least losing more of their credibility, which motivates people to seek alternatives.
Right. You mentioned farmland, and so I was going to ask what you make of the recent stories that we've been seeing about the food supply chain being disrupted. Has that concerned you either with respect to any of your personal involvement in farming, or, for me, I've been eating a lot of meat in the last year because I was already recovering from being ill last year. And I just, found that eating more meat is making me healthier. So I'm worried about that supply chain, but what about you?
I'm worried about it too. I mean, they're killing hundreds of thousands of hogs. I don't know what's going to happen with cows. I know that the cattle market is screwed up not because there aren't plenty of hogs and plenty of cows, but because the processing facilities are having, a problem with the virus. They're taking steps.
Are they closing down because of liability concerns? Do you think it's overcautious? Do you think they're overcautious?
No, they're being closed by state governments.
So the state governments are telling them they must close when they have X infections. So it is a lockdown phenomenon.
No, lockdown. I guess in some cases they more threatened them than actually, but if
sure, right, yeah.
What are you going to do? In fact, there's been several of the CEOs that said, look, people want meat, and if we don't get meat, it's one thing you can't get paper towels. It's another thing when you can't get meat. Trump acted and said that the meat packing plants should stay open, which, the way he did it was kind of ham-fisted, but he's right. They shouldn't.
Well, I mean, especially if the cause of it was similar ham-fisting behind the scenes quietly by the state governors. He's just, and it'd be nice if he exposed that. Did he expose that at the same time? That I didn't see. Yeah.
But I think it's critical to keep those facilities open. They obviously could test people. They could take
They take their temperatures when they come in and stuff. Yeah.
They can do plenty of things to reduce the risk in those facilities. So I think that's critical. So there actually is plenty of meat. It's just whether you can get it to the marketplace or not.
Yeah. And from the perspective of your farmland, kind of similar concerns, or it's not devoted to livestock?
It's not livestock. We have apples. We have orchards.
Just the apples for now. Okay. And the bees.
We're play farmer. You know what I mean? It's not our livelihood, but we have.
I learned a little, by the way. I'm teaching an online logic class right now, which I thought would be something fun to do. I had meant to do it for a long time, and this seemed like the time. But one of my students told me that there are vaccines that are actually given to bees. I didn't even know that there was such a. So I've assumed that you've gotten a full education on things like that.
Yeah, my wife is really the beekeeper, and she's got a couple 100,000 bees, and she did it in theory, for the orchard, for the apples, and we have we have blueberries and those kind of things. But she learned a lot about it. There is it's a mite that's really killing bees, not a virus.
Okay.
And it's had a huge impact on the bee population, and something like 60% of our food is pollinated by bees. So, the mite can be fought, but it has to be fought one-on-one. And so the big problem has been these trucks that drive around and say to go pecans or almonds. Almonds in particular get ready in a short period of time. The trees are all grown together now for economic reasons. And if you don't have bees to pollinate the trees in this short window, you won't have an almond crop. Mm. But that's where they're having the biggest trouble with these mites wiping out hives of bees.
Oh, wow. With respect to the almonds, now I can't even eat almonds right now. It's another story for another day, but oh well. A lot of people love those, and they depend on them for a good protein food source.
Well, very healthy.
Yeah.
But that's true for a lot. I mean, most crops have some bee impact, and many they're really dependent on bees to pollinate.
Right. Okay, one other question, and this comes, actually, maybe he's got a couple questions. This is Michael. What is your take on quantitative easing generally? Is it a legitimate tool or just a tricky way to devalue the currency? Or is it just basically the same as the inflation in the 70s? Is it different than that?
Well, quantitative easing is no different from the inflation in the 70s, but what the Fed did is different, and it's kind of bizarre. People don't get this. The Fed started effectively printing money through quantitative easing, which is really what that's about. But simultaneously, they started paying high interest rates on bank reserves. The way our economic system works, banks multiply the core reserves that the Fed creates. Banks loan you put a deposit in the bank loans that money to Fred. Fred puts part of that money back in the bank. The bank loans what money Fred put back in the bank to Susie, and banks basically multiply the money 5-10 to 1.
Okay.
So you have to really increase the base money supply to offset the fall in that multiple. Now, what happens in recessions, the multiple flies naturally because people become more conservative, they spend less of their money, they invest less. But the Fed, by paying higher interest rates than the market on reserves, created a huge incentive for banks to have excess reserves, more reserves than they needed. And that's why you didn't get inflation, but it's also why it took so long for the economy to recover. It's kind of unbelievable in my view, while they on one hand would do quantitative easing, and on the other hand, they would basically
and that makes sense, right? Because it's in effect it's the government keeping control over where the money is going, versus if the banks were to lower their reserves, the banks would just make their decision on what is a good investment, and the people who were offering the most productive uses of money would be the ones who are getting it, right?
What effectively happens, it brings down the federal government's cost of money.
Sure.
So
and then it allows them to determine where the money goes,
and them to borrow money more and spend more. So that it's really effectively practically a subsidy to the federal government.
And therefore over the winners that the federal government chooses.
Yeah, however the federal government chooses to spend its money.
Yeah. So no wonder it reduces the ability to recover, because the recovery is best in the hands of the entrepreneurs and the innovators, not the bureaucrats.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So quantitative easing creates inflation, but they more than offset it by increasing bank reserves by paying high rates on those reserves.
And so maybe it's more pernicious in that way then. Even.
I think it's more, it ends up subsidizing the government more at the expense of private industry.
Okay. Low interest rates. What are your thoughts regarding the fragility of so many businesses and their lack of long-term financing to survive the pandemic? Is this due to the manipulation of short-term interest, or are there other relevant factors?
Well, I think short-term interest has created a huge temptation, and I think we're going to see an awful lot of bankruptcies. That doesn't mean that the companies won't recover from the bankruptcy. A lot of times, in our lifetime, many airlines have been bankrupt many times and come back to life. But it does create a lot of short-term negative effect on human beings, on people that get laid off, on the quality of air travel and those kind of things. So I think you're going to see a lot of bankruptcies. Unfortunately, I think the worst thing, you'll see a lot of small businesses fail and they'll never rise back up. And that's the tragedy. So that's going to shift resources to larger companies, not naturally, if you understand what I'm saying, not by economic factors, but by the government action in this case. And I think that's a huge negative. And that reduces innovation and creativity.
So going around and supporting the small businesses that you really care about surviving in whatever way you can would be something that an individual could do during this time.
And I think it's a good thing. I mean, my wife and I, we generally cook our food, but now that we're taking out and we're going to the small restaurants that we like to go to, and maybe getting more takeout than we would have because we hate to see those businesses fold.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a wonderful thing that you're doing. And from what I understand from experts, that's a fairly low risk thing as well, despite what all the worries are out there. So we only have a couple minutes left, and I wanted to sort of turn the conversation this way. Anyway, Michael, again, one of the supporters of my show, he asks, are there any contemporary economists that you like to follow and read? But I want to expand that. Is there anything that you're enjoying reading generally during this crazy time?
Well, for economists, George Selgin at Cato is a real genius on monetary policy and has written a number of books on monetary policy. Myself, I'm a model railroader, and I have gotten interested in the history of railroads, studying what happened with railroads. And in the early 1900s, railroads were by far the dominant industry, much more dominant than, say, technology is today. and they were basically destroyed by regulations.
Mm-hmm.
And I see from studying the history of railroads an analogy with the banking business and how much damage has been done to the banking. And one reason the Fed is having to pump out so much money is the banks don't have the same control of economic activity, because a lot of it has gone out of the industry basically because it's not regulated, not because they've done a better job, but because they don't have to put up with the Federal Reserve. And I think it's interesting that, you know, left-wing people are promoting high-speed trains now, and yet their controls are why the railroads don't have high-speed trains.
Right.
It's really
Right.
ironic. And there's huge subsidies to highways, to airlines. And it's very interesting of the incredible negative impact of the government over-regulation of the railroad industry, and the same thing to the banking business. And maybe someday I'll write a book about, here's examples of how the government over the long term, trying to protect employees or do whatever it is, control prices, creates huge negative damage for areas at the left. I mean, the environmental damage is very dramatic if
Right.
that's what you're worried about, because railroads are far more environmentally better than trucks.
Sure.
And yet trucks have gotten massive subsidies because we built interstate highways and let them ride on them without paying their freight.
Oh.
So anyway, I've been studying the history of railroads. And,
That would be great to see another book from you.
well, I might do it.
No duties, right? We don't believe in duties or shoulds, but I would welcome it and would love to see it. So during this time, you said you're working a whole lot. Are there any things that you've been doing just for enjoyment? There's been a lot of online content from musicians and otherwise. Have you consumed any of that?
Well, the two things I've been doing, I like to exercise, and I've been doing a lot of walking. The parks are closed, but there's still plenty of places to walk around here. And also up in the mountains, we can walk. And I enjoy that. And our farming's fun. It's, you know, it's a hobby farm, so we have a good time. And I enjoy working with my wife on the bees. She does the bees. I'm reading more, I think, because I have more time to do that. And then I have a model railroad that I'm working on. It's always gives me something else to think about.
Okay, so not so much online content. I will send you that one clip of Brad Pitt just because I think you'll get a nice
sure.
laugh out of it, just like I did. And then I can't remember whether you were familiar with Tamir Hendelman, the jazz pianist.
Say that again. I didn't know.
Tamir Hendelman, the jazz pianist that Leonard and I had followed forever. No? Okay, well, I'll send you a link to that. He's been doing a series of online concerts once a week, which is a first for him. A lot of people are finding innovative ways to take advantage of online. And I tend to agree with you that we might see, not necessarily in music performances, live shows are really nice, but with respect to work, maybe a more healthy balance between working from home and saving some of that time and mental energy, and then still going in and having some human contact sometimes, right?
It's hard to believe it won't negatively in places like New York City, and people don't have to do all that, and there's no necessarily physical reason for them to be there. I think it's going to have a big long-term effect on New York City and a few other cities like that. Because think about how much time people spend commuting, and a lot of them are going to realize, boy, this is unnecessary. And you don't even have to do it from home. They might do it in a business, but there's no, not downtown New York City. So it'll be interesting to see. I don't think it's the actual deaths that will impact New York City and economic. It's obviously that's bad, but I think that people experimenting and doing their work, they might decide to go in 2 days a week instead of 5, and it's hard to believe it won't create a gut of commercial space.
Well, then maybe the subways won't be as crowded, and then any infection that ever comes in the future, because this won't be the last one, won't spread as quickly either, right? So
that might be true too.
Yeah. Any last words for? I mean, what are you telling your family? Are you kind of the rock of optimism that I'm sitting here pushing? Please, John, be the rock of optimism.
I am. I think you can still live a good life despite all this stuff. I don't like a lot of things that are happening in the economy. I think they're unnecessary. I don't like the constraints. I don't like the attack on freedom. But this is still a great country, and there's still a lot of opportunity to try to defend the principles that have made this country great. And I think that's both challenging and also enjoyable, because it gives you a sense of purpose. And You know, I'm very involved with the Center for the Study of Capitalism at Wake Forest. And, you know, this is an opportunity to talk about the other side, to say, hey, didn't the government make it not just concrete in the short term, but what about the FDA? What are all these policies? How much of them have resulted in the problems we're facing today? And I consider that enjoyable.
Yes, and hopefully also very useful too.
Yep.
Like you always talk about, I always love, you always say, you know, a mission for anybody, an individual, an organization should be make the world a better place while doing, you know, by doing this. What is it that you're going to be doing? And hopefully it's something that you enjoy,
Yep.
and then at the same time is going to contribute to that. And all the things that you've done have, I hope for you, been so enjoyable, but I know that they have made the world a much better place. So
thank you. I think everybody needs a purpose, making the world a better place to live, but doing something they want to do to do it, because your life is precious. But I do think people enjoy making the world a better place to live. You know, it doesn't have to be dramatic, but just moving it a few inches in the right direction, doing something you enjoy doing.
yeah, exactly. Thank you so much.
Oh, sure.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I look forward to hearing whatever you have that comes out of this period, whether it's railroads or fighting the FDA or anything else.
Very good. Thank you, Amy.
You take care, and give my best to Betty and everybody else.
I will. Thank you.